5 quotations from Macbeth. You have seen these before, so you should know them really well, and I know that I'm going to see some strong responses. Okay, good. I've got now 90% of people sorted. Okay, finishing 5 of those quotations off for me, please. So you're going to have 2.5 minutes. And then number 5 is, what is the common thread? What is the connection between those quotations? So what is the common thread at number 5? The first thing that you will have noticed in terms of feedback in the lesson was during the do now. So while students were doing the do now, I really specifically focused on hunting for specific answers rather than fishing. So that just means I'm looking for misconceptions, maybe things they've not quite got right, or even things they have got right, so I can internalise those and check. And that process is really important in terms of checking for understanding in the lesson, so that you are never surprised by something doesn't, you're not reacting in a way which is overly unexpected. You are actually pre-preparing what you might see from your do now. Maybe you're anticipating misconceptions and looking for them. Really trying to get to that number 5, which is the connection. Okay, 1 minute. And what you'll have then seen is just a whiteboard routine in which students all show me their responses from the do now. And what that allowed me to see in terms of assessment was the whole room's responses. Now, that is quite an intimidating moment. You get to see 30 whiteboards with lots of writing on. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to compartmentalise the things I'm seeing and prioritising maybe common errors across the room. So if I glance, for example, and see that number 4 has been answered poorly, or maybe there's gaps, then that will be the focus of my feedback. I might just be simply scanning for one answer, and I might plan to do that, and I might ignore the rest and be selective about that, because we can't fix all the problems in one go. Or I might respond to what I see if something does arise that I hadn't anticipated. So it's pre-planning what you might see from the results of your do now, but also really considering and responding to what actually happens, which is quite a balancing act. Okay, find our green pens, so just switching over to your green. Any issues with it, just use the black one that you marked with. I didn't see too many problems with 1 to 5. A couple of people just need reminding of number 4. And then 5, we can have a little bit more discussion around. So finishing that first one off, is this a dagger I can see before me? Okay, so that comes from one of Macbeth's important soliloquies. So we know he's envisioning that dagger. And then the second one, thou shalt be king hereafter. Cold come in, who actually uses those words? So, all hail Macbeth, thou shalt be king hereafter. Mamadou? Absolutely, so the witches are the weird sisters. So that really establishes that idea of ambition, it plants that seed. We've got of my intent, so if we look at the full quotation for that one, just so we can see it in full, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. So remember, spur is almost like a reason or a motivator, and Macbeth is acknowledging that he has no reason other than ambition, which isn't enough for him, to kill King Duncan. And then we've got see my dark and deep desires. See my dark and deep desires. Just checking and changing with that one. So number 4, stars hide your fires, let not light. See my dark and deep desires. What have we got an example of there? So kind of what common theme do we see with that idea of hiding his desires under the sort of shadow of darkness? What theme are we seeing there? Just turn and talk, 10 seconds for me. And what I then did in the review now is that I ensured all students were given the feedback on what I had seen. So there will be certain things that I might write down and come back to later that I won't worry about. There were other things in that do now that I immediately responded to there and then. So I looked at a specific question. So number 5, we were all definitely going to look at. The others I quickly went through and we checked. But I also cold called during that review now process just to check for further understanding. So a lot of the students who got 1 to 4 correct. So rather than just sort of ticking and moving on, I did develop their understanding of those specific quotations by asking them, well, what technique is this? Or what does this tell us about the character of Macbeth? So I kind of expanded on the correct answers and gave them that slightly more rigorous bit of feedback. And then number 5, we all focused together. I used turn and talk in there as well, just to give students a moment to check themselves and think a little bit further about the questions that they'd answered before taking that feedback after the turn and talk. Ambition or vaulting ambition. So just ticking the ones you've got, adding any that you're missing, they're all valid, and I'd like to just talk about one of them. Okay, so just checking and changing there. The one I'd like to focus on is how each one demonstrates internal conflict. So again, spend a little bit longer this time, 30 seconds. Talk through 4 quotations. Where is the internal conflict? So 100% of us turning and talking, 30 seconds. Okay, 10. You ready to share in 5? 3. Okay, thank you for turning and tracking if you need to. So we're looking for, why is it internal conflict? So we know internal conflict is conflict which happens within inside of someone, doesn't it? So it's maybe their decision-making process. It could be 2 conflicting passions that they have. That might be internal conflict. So the first one is obviously that floating dagger. How does that demonstrate internal conflict? Saba? Lovely. So that floating dagger, the visions that we know is a common motif in the play, is a result of internal conflict. Thou shalt be king hereafter. How does that link to internal conflict? That's a bit trickier because it's the witches speaking. What do we think, Shalomi? Nice. So lovely. It kind of embeds the inner conflict in him. It plants that. It's the origins of it. I like the way you put that. So his inner conflict arises perhaps because of the witches saying those words. Prick the sides of my intent. So here you've got Macbeth deciding whether or not to do something, which is obviously in a conflict because he's deciding whether or not to go through with the murder of Duncan. And then we've talked about the duplicity of my deep and dark desires. You've got someone who is literally deciding whether or not to show his true self. What technique is used there when it's to see my dark and deep desires? What technique really demonstrates that inner conflict well there? Just turn your prism if you're confident with that one. It would be a stage direction before the speech. Sana? Not quite. Modu? You have it there? Just track me again, it's fine. Go on. That's right, so aside, okay? So we know it's an aside, and we know an aside is where Macbeth talks specifically to the audience, and it's often revealing his inner thoughts. Right, lovely, we can wipe off our balls and pop them back under our baskets, and I'd like you just to find your English Language Paper 2 booklets, please. So underneath our baskets, English Language Paper 2 booklets. Lovely. So we are finding that, and we're also finding our exercise book. So doing that in our natural state. Thank you, Chidi. Okay. Good. Once we're ready, we've got a title and date just to write in there. So Wednesday the 14th of September. Wednesday the 14th of September. Just underlining it. And then our title is Analysing Language in Non-Fiction. Great. when you've written that title, page 15 is the page in our booklet we're going to be referring to today. So you can be getting that ready, prepared. So analysing language and non-fiction. Start fresh. So analysing language, page 15. And when you're there on page 15, just start to track the text that you see. And then in around 30 seconds, we'll come together and begin to read through that. Good, most people are there. So we've started to prepare for our language paper 2, and we know that in language paper 2 we're dealing with non-fiction, and we talked yesterday about literary non-fiction and how what we'd expect to see in some non-fiction is not just facts and persuasion, but we might see elements of description that you would expect to see in fiction, for example, or a novel. And that's what we're going to encounter today. We know that in that language paper 2, one of our questions is to analyse language, just like it is in language paper 1, which is about fiction, of course. So we're actually doing the same thing. Okay, you've just got to appreciate the context of the text. So on page 15, so hopefully we're all there now, you will see the title Analysing Non-Fiction. Now, our job today is to look at a really specific passage and just practice that using that knowledge we have of non-fiction, but also analysing language. I'm also just going to show you and walk you through a few ways that you can construct a really high quality answer. So different phrases we can use and some different kind of structures we can also use. So we're going to just start by reading some of the information at the top of the booklet. This is always providing us with that kind of exam technique, really. So it's kind of stuff you can refer back to in revision. So just picking up, if I ask you to, could you just start us off there? Sana, so question 3 requires?
Question 3 requires us to analyse language in a short extract from either source A or source B. The extract will not be reprinted for you, so the first thing you should do is draw a box around the specified section using the line numbers. The question is assessing your ability to comment in detail on the effects of the writer's language choices. The high-level responses will also have a clear understanding of how the writer is conveying the big ideas to help.
Thanks, Anna. So if we just look at that last sentence we've just read, the highest level responses will have a clear understanding of how the writer is conveying the big ideas we've looked at too. So yesterday we talked about what we need to do in our text is find a common thread. So if this is a text, for example, from a piece of travel writing, what is the big theme that travel writer is coming back to all the time? Is it to do with fear? Is it to do with adventure or the outdoors? What is the big thing? So we need to find that thread, and that will help us to analyse the language. It is something you're familiar with. So here is an example of what the question looks like. Okay, so it's literally lifted from an exam paper. So just reading the question out for us, Josh, starting with you now.
Now I need to refer only to source A from line 16 to 26. How does the writer use language to describe the power of the sea?
Let's just underline or highlight power of the sea. Power of the sea, so that's obviously the focus of that question. Now the other thing Josh read there was source A. Remember there are 2, so it's directing you, and it says line 16 to 26. Just remember that in paper 1, the extract is given to you. In paper 2, it's not. You just have to follow that guidance. And the thing to just be aware of is don't stray outside of those lines, okay? Don't stray as the lesson went on, and if we're focusing on the feedback that was given in the lesson, there were lots of moments through the lesson in which I took feedback on a very soft level. So, for example, as we were reading the text, I was asking other students to read, and then I could explain our correct answers as we went if they were misreading something. Or if, for example, they weren't sure what a word meant, I would correct that as I went. There's a lot of kind of adventuring around the world, and he's going to be describing his experience on the seas. And what we're going to look for and track for is the power of the sea. So obviously the question is saying power of the sea. That's what we're going to really, really focus on, okay? So again, just read it through once together. Don't worry about anything else, and then we'll read it again, looking and tracking for specific themes. So just be ready to pick up if I ask you. I'll start us off. Track your text with your pen. I watched as a vast wave gathered behind the boat, soaring above the cabin. A wall of white water towering over our tiny boat. Once again, I dug the oars in to propel us forward, but the wave was too big. For a moment, it felt like we were moving backwards as we sucked into the belly of the wave. the horizon disappearing as the churning surf enveloped the stern of the boat. The stern is, I always forget whether it's back or front, but some of you might know. But the stern is one end of the boat. I'm assuming the front. I felt it lift as a torrent of water crashed over the boat and I felt myself falling backwards. I was aware of the boat collapsing on top of me. I struggled to pull my feet from the stirrups up to no avail. The world went black. I felt a weight on top of me and then a rush of cold water as my body was brutally submerged into the bottomless Atlantic Ocean. My feet were sucked from my shoes as I clung onto the oars for dear life, but then they too were dragged from my clasp. My mind went blank as I tumbled through the surf, spun around roughly like clothes in a washing machine. Okay, we'll pause there. Now, you would have read that ordinarily as part of a bigger text, so there'd be a little bit more context around it. But we can just really drill down and focus on what we're seeing there, okay? So you have this description of the sea and the waves first, and then almost like what it does to him afterwards. So there's that kind of action around the effect on the writer himself. I want you to track through on your own. So again, read through a second time. It's crucial in the exam that you read through multiple times, okay, just so that you are happy with it. And I want you to track the theme of the power of the sea. So with a highlighter or pen, any evidence linked to the power of sea, just track it. Okay, just spend 2 minutes reading through, tracking that theme, and just be ready to feed back. So quick highlighting job first. You can start to annotate, but just as long as you get that evidence as a priority. Okay, just 30 seconds or so. If you've just got a bunch of evidence for now, that's not a problem. Okay. Okay, and 10, just track back this way on the whiteboard. Okay, 5. So popping our highlighters down just so that we can really focus here. This is also in your booklets. So this is almost like a preparation grid in your booklet which supports you with the thinking process behind this kind of question. So you have what is the main focus. We know it's the power of the sea. We've highlighted that. Now, if we're thinking about big ideas, some of you may have begun to sort of amass those thoughts already. We're going to use this specific big idea. So the power of nature versus mankind. So the big idea here is how nature overpowers mankind. Nature is always more powerful. So we've seen that in quite a few of our texts across the literature course as well, haven't we? That's what we're going to focus on. Now, what we want to try and do now is identify a couple of patterns. I've talked to you about patterns before. The best way to select language is to look for common patterns of specific techniques being used, or maybe meanings that are similar throughout. Okay, so just now, go into your text again with your evidence that you've highlighted. What patterns are you seeing? Okay, I don't want you to write in the boxes just yet. So just what patterns are you seeing? And I want you to take your mini whiteboard out whilst you are scanning through. And on your mini whiteboard, just write down quotations or words, it might just be single words, that you think go together. So it's grouping some of the words, grouping the evidence, spotting patterns. So you might want to just focus on one pattern to start with, that's fine. Group them on your mini whiteboard. If you see 2 patterns, maybe you're going to divide your board in half and have one side dedicated to one pattern, the other side dedicated to the other. So look for a pattern, jot down the quotations. Once we were into the phase where we were annotating and reading the text, I got them to jot down things that they were picking up on their whiteboards. So that, again, really allowed me to see quickly what their thought processes were. So rather than just telling them to highlight the quotations and then move on, I did get them to sort of pause and show me again with their whiteboards, just so I could check we're on the right page. If there were students who maybe had missed a few really essential quotations, that gave me an opportunity to give them that feedback and ensure we all had it. But again, building in even those small moments of feedback where you get students to show you universally what they know or what they've done, just allows you to calibrate your next steps in the lesson. So before we looked, for example, at writing or crafting a response, I was just checking that we all had the quotations we needed and the ideas that we needed. So that was something that I built in specifically. Even if what you are seeing is right, that's fine. It gives you the green light to move on to the C. So maybe what's happening to that person. Both are completely valid. Throughout the whole lesson, I circulated a lot. And whilst that doesn't feel like feedback, what I was doing throughout was just internalizing certain students' responses. So I was always reading and glancing through their books and their notes, just so that I could constantly gauge what they knew and what their thought processes were and what they were doing. And that did inform who I might cold call later down the line. It informed me who I might, show work under the visualizer. And what I might go away and do after the lesson is just jot down things I noticed from specific students, if there were any issues I didn't want to deal with then. So part of the process of that feedback loop is in the lesson, going round and just simply reading the work constantly. One quick scan, just to see if there's anything that I might not have thought of, but also where you're at in terms of your thinking. So be ready with your board in 7 seconds. In 5. Just getting there, just cutting yourself short if you need to, it's not a problem. 5, 4, 3, 2, thanks, Sarith. 1, show me. Can we join us? Okay, and I'm just going to narrate what I can see. And then if you wanted to afterwards, if you've got something you can add, then add based on what I've seen. So a lot of people have grouped, from what I can see, this idea of size or some other synonym to do that. So they're quoting vast, maybe towering, are going together, wall of white water. So you've got this sort of size, this physical size, but then also we've got people who are grouping the behaviour of the sea and how it then affects the writer. So some people are talking about almost the control it has over the writer. So they're looking at some of the adverbs and verbs like crashed, submerged, brutally. Okay, so that's one other group that I can see. There may be one or two others, but that's okay for now. Pop them down, keep them on your boards, because they'll be really useful in a moment. Now, all I want you to do is to fill out, so underneath you've just got those two boxes. So I'm going to show you how I pre-prepared, and then you can either really lean on me, or you can sort of twist it and make it a little bit more how you would write it personally. So these two boxes are very much the same. They're just asking you to pick out patterns of language, so writing down what techniques you see, but also quotations. So let me just show you, I've grouped it into two. So the first one is I looked at the size. So I've said that the sea comes across as limitless and immeasurable. So it's got no limits and you can't measure it. So if you want to steal that phrasing, write that down now. So limitless and immeasurable. So that is the vastness of it. And then I've just written down some of those quotations there. So again, just write the ones down that you want to use. So it might be from your whiteboard. Vast wave, wall of white water, towering and bottomless. And those are adjectives, and there's one metaphor there, wall of white water. So again, lean on my phrasing if you need to, and jotting down the quotes that you would refer to for that particular idea. Okay. And again, similarly to what a lot of you did, I came up with a second sort of section, a second pattern, and that was to do with the violence of the sea and what it physically does to the not the speaker, but the writer. So, for example, there's a lot of violent sounding verbs or adverbs which give the sea this ruthless nature. So I picked out, for example, soaring, churning, crashed, brutally and roughly. So a lot of the words that are used to sort of affect the writer, I've picked them out. It gives the sea a ruthless nature, a ruthless nature. So again, if you want to steal my statement for that and have that, do that, or you can reword it as your own. Good. So just 30 seconds jotting down your quotations. Okay. When we're ready, we're going to turn to our exercise books. And I've just got 3 bullet points for you to write down about how we would go about answering the question. So the first one is just about big ideas, framing around a big idea. Jot that down as a success criteria. Refer to methods is your second one. And your third one is analysing how language conveys the big idea. So jot down your success criteria before we practice doing any writing on it. So framing it around a big idea, that's the first thing you're aiming to do. We might put a tick next to it as that's what we need to achieve in the question. Refer to methods, and then analysing how the language conveys it. So we've done the preparation. And this can be something you go back to as a reference around what you need. It's worth 12 marks. And when we get closer to that exam, so for example in your mock exams, we will look at timings and I'll give you further advice on how long to spend then. But for now, we're just practicing the craft. Okay, when you're ready, just track the board again. In a moment, what we're going to do is start to write together a response and how that might look. Now, I'm going to give you that choice as always. When we do that together under the visualizer, you can choose to write with me for the first paragraph, but if you want to choose and change the phrasing of yours, you absolutely can do that, because I know you often do. So I'm going to show you what needs to be there. You can follow along, but you can also adapt it as you go with your own ideas, maybe your own quotations, okay? So you can have a slight change to it if you need, okay? So together we're just going to start by establishing that big idea. Now the big idea I wanted to start with was the writer uses language to describe the sea as limitless and immeasurable. I thought that was a really nice conceptual way of talking about the text as a whole. So I've started with that. You can borrow it or you can phrase your own. So start with your big idea. And it would be great to see some other examples of how you phrase the big idea in that text. Okay. Now, here's a little trick I want to kind of introduce to you. We know we need embedded quotations. We know we need to analyse the language. There are a few tricks we can use in order to really develop our response. So I've written these tricks in the margin. You don't have to do that. You don't have to copy them up into the margin. But we're going to start with a little trick which is just called it is as if. And we're going to use the phrase it is as if to try and compare how we perceive the power of the sea to something else. So this is my example, so you can track and watch my example, or you can begin to craft your own as I go along. So I'm going to kind of compare the fact that this limitless and immeasurable sea is almost like this hulking, almost like a beast that is out to get the writer. So I'm going to try to make a comparison in my analysis. So we're going to do that with the phrase it is as if. So I'm going to use it is as if in a new sentence there. So it is as if the sea is and I'm going to describe it as a hulking predator, something which is out to get the writer, a hulking predator. And I'm going to just elaborate on that. That wishes to I'll zoom out a tiny bit for you. That wishes to consume the writer. And as its prey, as its prey. So what I've done there is, I've not talked about any quotations yet, but I've just established a really perceptive view on the text. So I'm not going straight into a quotation. I'm actually saying, I really understand the big purpose of this text. Maybe the writer is wanting the sea to come across as this kind of enemy to the writer, maybe as this predator, something that is threatening it. And that's how I've done it. So I've used that phrase, it is as if, as a way to develop that response. That might be a trick you wish to use. So you've either got mine down, or maybe you are developing your own as we speak. Maybe you're tweaking it as your own. And then in a moment, I will talk about where we would go next, because we need to talk about the language, don't we? Now, some of your next steps are often around developing your analysis and explaining it fully. Because often you've got a great idea, you now need to develop it. And the simple way of doing that is, and you know, I'm not patronising you by saying this, but using the word because will do us all a lot of good. Okay, so we're going to try and specifically use the word because in our analysis. And it's very simple, it sounds really silly, but that will force you to develop your ideas. And for some of you, that's what will take you up the mark scheme. So I'm going to now focus in on some of the adjectives such as vast and bottomless, and then I'm going to try and explain them in some detail. As I write, you are either writing down my example or you are crafting your own in the same way. So you might want to watch for a little while, then write your own, or you're just continuing to track. So I'm going to start with the writer uses the adjectives vast. Remember that is a single word quotation, it's embedded. And bottomless. So I've paired them together, okay, because I think they go well together under that pattern that we've seen about size and scale. Some of you I've seen talking about them as if they're a semantic field, so a group of words that come together through meanings. That's really good. So vast and bottomless, because. So we're going to use that word because. He wishes to convey, and we're going to use that analytical verb convey because it's really good for saying, well, what is the message he's sending? So he wants to convey a sense of. And again, a really good trick is to use that phrase, a sense of. What are the impressions you are getting from those quotations? He wishes to convey a sense of. So I was thinking of other ways of describing that immeasurability and the limitlessness. So invincible came to mind, that there's no way the writer will be able to defeat the sea or the wave, and the sheer size of it. Okay, so I'm going to say a sense of invincibility. Okay, and sheer scale behind the sea's actions. So I've just used a few small tricks to really analyse the language there. Obviously I've used two quotations, but I've used the word because, I've used the word convey, and I've really used a sense of as a way of building in that connotation analysis, okay? What I want you to do now is spend a couple of minutes just developing this. So there could be another couple of quotes that are relevant that we wrote down. So you might develop this by using the phrase, this is developed, very simple, through, and I want you to carry on. So I just want you to carry on and maybe write about one or two other quotations linked to the same pattern. So develop that response, okay? Develop that response. So this is developed through, maybe later in the text you see another example of that size and scale. So again, 3 minutes, just develop that response on your own. And then it'd be great to see a couple of examples at the end or in the next few minutes. So this is developed when. Try and maybe use the word because again. Try and use the phrase a sense of. And continue the pattern. That's the key thing. You are continuing the pattern. Keep going down now. So we're writing for the full time. Okay, I know you might be in the middle of that. On the board, I've just written how you might move that idea forward. So if you get to a point where you've exhausted that first idea about the sea being huge, and you want to talk about the more violent section where it talks about how he's being churned, then use this connecting phrase. Furthermore, we also see described, and move on to your second big idea. And I just want you to now naturally move on and write for 5 more minutes, just focusing on either that first idea first, but then move towards that second idea. So maybe you're going to talk about the violence of the waves, or the way he is almost thrown around and treated by the sea. So move on and practice the same structure, the same process just for that next bit. And I'm going to come round and just see if we've got any great examples that we can feed back on at the end. Torrent, so a torrent of rain is like a really heavy downpour of like rain or water. So it's like clearly coming in, really heavily into the boat, the water. So when you're ready, moving on to big idea 2, I phrased it along the lines of the use of violent verbs and adverbs. Go try and sort of specifically look at brutally and dragged. So you could say that creates a sense of threat, doesn't it? It's almost like something is physically attacking him. So drill down into that language rather than just saying power of nature. Good. Some people adapt in that big idea, so they're talking about the controlling nature of the sea, or the threat the sea brings. Okay, we're just going to write for 2 more minutes. Again, you might not get a full response yet at that time, but it's really crucial practice. I'm just seeing a few people using that phrase really well. We also see described, so they're linking it to the next one, but then repeating that process. You don't have to do it is as if again, but you could, you're using the same craft. So you may be talking about what it comes across like, and then really drilling down into the word choices. Okay, 1 more minute writing time. And then we'll have our green pens ready and we're going to check and change what we've done. Okay, be ready to finish the sentence you're writing then, and then we'll track an example on the board. Okay, 10 seconds. Just make sure you're ready to just track back this way. I know you've done a really, really good effort there, and I know you want to continue. But now's the time just to assess really kind of what we've managed to do. Good, let's just have a couple of people join us. Lovely. So for now, if you find your green pen and you have that ready in your hands, because we will do a little bit of marking as we go, I'd like to just share an example which has spent a bit more time changing the wording from what I used, so you can really assess it against your own. So the first thing we're going to check for, and this was a success as I was going around the room, I could see that we were engaging with those big ideas really well and using that phrase, it is as if, really effectively. So here's a nice kind of twist on that at the beginning. So the writer uses language to describe the sea as barbaric, limitless and immeasurable. So obviously it's partly like mine, but we've also got the use of barbaric in there. So we've kind of added in a detail which I really like. So again, just with your green pen, checking you've got that opening statement. It might look exactly the same as mine, but we're going to give it a tick. If you've got it, tick the adjectives you've used. So obviously limitless and immeasurable I used, but we've got another one here, barbaric. And I saw others around the room, okay? So people talking about the sheer scale of the water or the controlling nature, that would also count. So that's a really lovely way to start. It is as if, so making sure we've used that phrase, it is as if the sea is a hulking predator that wishes to consume the writer as its feasting prey. So again, very similar to mine, but check you've got one, even if you've changed it a little bit. Underline, it is as if. It is as if. Underline that. Just check you've used that phrasing because that's what we practiced. Which establishes the clear power dynamic between man and nature and underlines the overwhelming and ruthless temperament of the sea. Now that little bit of analysis comes right after that quotation, and I think it's just really effective in its description of the ruthless temperament. So I think we need to just look at that word temperament and just see if you can include it in your work somewhere. So temperament is almost like your nature. So this response is saying that the sea's nature is quite ruthless in its temperament. So it can, handle you very, dangerously. It can become a threat to you very quickly. So if you think about Storm on the Island in that poem, we had nature turning really quickly on the islanders, becoming ruthless in its temperament. Check where you've talked about the sea and see if you can add in that word temperament or ruthless as a phrase, because I think it's one we could all do with, okay? So just scan through your work now, spend 30 seconds or so seeing if you can use it, see if you can add it in. Okay? And then it starts to really speak about the specific word and the language here. So we need to check we've all embedded our quotations. The writer utilises the adjectives vast and bottomless. So again, checking your embedded quotations there, making sure that they fit right into your sentences. Because, underlining your use of because that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to develop our response and explain why those words are used. Ultimately, that's the important thing here. He wishes to convey a sense of indestructibility. As the lesson went on, we spent a little bit of time doing some live writing, but the key piece of feedback that went on towards the end of the lesson was a show call. And if we build this in as part of our normal lesson routine, show call becomes something which raises standards in the classroom. It normalises excellence because students know that they are going to see examples of either excellent examples or examples that can be improved in front of their eyes. And it, over time, reduces the anxiety for the students, which is a common misconception. If it's normalised, the anxiety gets reduced because students realise that it's a classroom of feedback. It's a classroom where they are never judged for the work they've done, but instead they're encouraged to improve it. So that process of show call can be a really crucial factor, not only for feedback, but for the culture of the room. In this instance, while students had written independently for around 10 minutes, I just took one example, which I knew was an example of excellence. And the purpose was of choosing that one was to show the class this is what you're aiming for, but also giving them instructions on how to get there too. So I instructed the students to look for specific features which I ticked or underlined, or sometimes I might annotate in that student's work as if I was marking it after the lesson. But I was doing it live under the visualizer, and then really ensuring that students were doing that themselves and putting the accountability onto them. So asking them to check for this or address this in their work. During that process, I might cold call and just check that students are tracking along and that they understand what I'm asking them to do. I also cold called one slight misconception during that show call from the student whose work it was, who realised the small error that she'd made. So that process of show call is really, really crucial in holding the students to account, and it's really important that they are active during that process and making the amendments that you are instructing them to do. In another instance, which wasn't in that specific lesson, I might choose a work which is more middling, so we would call that good to great. So with the students, we would frame that as we're going to take a really good piece of work and make it even better, and you'd very much positively frame that. And you might show students how to improve that piece of work. Maybe it's a common misconception across the room. Maybe it's of a level which is you want it to be better and you know it can be better, and that's maybe common across half of the room. And it just allows everyone to up level gradually. So you show students under the visualizer how to make it better, rather than taking the books in at the end of the lesson and marking them and being reactive to it. Actually, in the lesson, they are shown what to do to be better, and you're doing that absolutely live in the room. At the end of the lesson, I just made sure students had sort of checked for those specific things under the visualizer, and I held them to account. Another strategy for that is to get students to show you the amendments they've made, or if I'd had a bit more time, I would have perhaps cold called a few students for their reflections on the work. So I might have asked them, for example, tell us one change you made, or tell us one thing that you added in based on the feedback that you've seen. Again, just to hold them to account, but also to really establish that culture of continuous improvement in English lessons, which is always tricky to do because we're often dealing with large pieces of writing and never just one word answers, which are easier to obviously feedback on. So I hope that really helped, and I hope that's helped to inform your practice moving forward.